welcome back to the Lions FLL Mentoring channel. My name is Dorian,
And my name is Claire.
and we're a former FLL team based in France, and this is our Lions FLL guide. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that if you click this video, you're interested in FLL. Today, we're going to talk about what the first steps to joining the first LEGO League are. If you want to learn more about FLL before taking that big leap, be sure to check out episode 1 in our series, which describe these different elements. Now, let's talk about the topic of today's video. You're interested in FLL, you want to join. Obviously, some of the first things that we're going to say might sound like common sense, but we'd rather say them than overlook something essential. Because we know that it can be a bit daunting, so let's take baby steps and walk you through it.
So let's start by finding a team, because for an individual student, finding a pre-existing team that can take you in, or if you're a parent watching this, finding a team that can take in your child will spare you some of the work needed to get a team off the ground. So maybe your school already has a team, or they'd be willing to expand their STEM program to include one. Although it's true that this does veer into starting a team territory. There might be a community center or some kind of town activity center that you could check out. So, for example, in France, those two categories, school-run and city-run teams, were the broad majority. Typing in FLL and the name of your country might also allow you to find the official website run by the FLL organizers in your country, and potentially find the name of teams that you could look up to see if they're in your area and if they would take in new members. However, please keep in mind that FLL cannot put you in contact with nearby teams for matters of basic safety and privacy. But maybe you can find a way to contact local teams if they're on social media, or to reach out to their coach. Unfortunately, there aren't FLL teams everywhere all the time. And for example, in France, finding a team in our area was very much so impossible, because there simply were no teams nearby. So we had to start our own team.
So, how about starting our own team? Well, here are the rules you need to know. At the time of filming, teams are composed of 2 to 10 kids aged 9 to 14 in the US and Canada, and 9 to 16 in the rest of the world. We were a very small team of only 2, and that worked fine for us. However, currently there are 2 home areas to handle on the mat, so it looks like teams of 2 or 3 might be at a disadvantage, especially since the rules now on how to spread out teams members are very specific. So, for example, you couldn't choose to do what we did, which is I was the one positioned with the robot launching the missions, and Claire would be the checklist, making sure that everything was laid out and ready and that everything worked. That's what worked for us, to spend as little time as possible in the base. But these days, we'd have to split up and each handle a launch area on our own. So maybe 4 members minimum might be a little bit more comfortable for a team starting out with younger members.
According to the FLL resources on the requirements for coaches and mentors, which we will be linking down below in the description, you will need at least 2 adults to be coaches for the team, and preferably at least one of them should be over the age of 25. Mentors are often former participants who have aged out of the competition but are still under 18. So if you're 13 or older but you can't coach yet because of the age restrictions, you could check out mentoring at a local team. Another thing to note is that you don't need to be an engineer, a scientist, or a teacher to coach. Of course, if you need some inspiration, you can check out the team meeting guide on the first website, and if it's helpful to you, great, please use it. Otherwise, you don't have to. For example, you might not be able to do all of the activities or all of the sessions in there in the right order or in the way that is provided in that team meeting guide because, for example, you don't have the mat yet. Another thing to note in the FLL philosophy is that kids do the work. Just make sure they don't break a leg in the process. Essentially, your job is to guide them through the process of creating the robot and working on the project, for example, by suggesting the timeline or the activities they could be doing during a session, or making sure that they get a break if a session runs a bit long. You should also be checking in on them so they get a chance to communicate their ideas, especially if they're younger or newer to FLL. It can take a little bit of time to get used to it and to get used to discussing your ideas with the rest of your team. Being the coach also means that you're the person who figures out when you're going to manage to have all the team members over for a team meeting and how long that's going to take and how often you're going to be able to have those meetings. And you can also be running the points of contacts with the outside world, for example, helping the members of a team order pieces, or by supervising their online activity, for example, when they want to update their team website, if they have one, or when they need to contact an expert by email. Another thing you should do is to make sure your team is aware of the competition dates and how much time they have left until them, because trust me, it doesn't look like it, but it creeps up on you.
So let's talk about our story in starting a team. So we were an independent team. That means that we weren't affiliated with either our school or with our city. And we actually formed the team fairly simply. Claire was interested in FLL. She had done a camp the summer before, and her dad was okay with coaching. So she made a sign and took it to our back to school picnic for the international school that we both went to in France. And my mom saw the sign. After a few minutes of talking together, we decided to give it a try and started sessions within the next 2 weeks. So we started small with just 2 members, and while we thought about expanding multiple times, it never really took shape. And honestly, we knew that we could never be a big team of 10 because we were doing it in Claire's living room, and there just wasn't enough space to fit that many kids there. So, I mean, the moral of the story is that it's okay to have a small team if you can't support it or if it's just not ready or meant for you.
So, okay, you found the people you needed to form a team. Now what? The first thing you'll want to do is to sign up for the season because you need to register to get the challenge set, and you'll want as much time as possible with that. Especially if you're in a country where mats arrive pretty late, which was our case in France, where getting it in mid September was actually quite early for us. And we have gotten it in October quite a few times. But that's not all, because all you're going to get in the mail is the mats, so the printed surface, bags of Lego pieces to build the mission models that go on the mats, and some dual lock tape to place the mission models on said mats. And you also get a couple of goodies, like a few Lego pins that you can make for your coach with a season theme on them. And you might notice that that doesn't include the robot, which is something else that you'll need to get. So back in our day, we used a Mindstorm EV3, and you can see pictures of the kit that we started with at the top. And while you can still legally use an EV3 in FLL, they've been replaced by the Spike robot, and so that means that it's easier to find Spike controllers and motors and sensors nowadays. Of course, you can get the pieces separately, or you can get any of the Spike sets you'd like, but we'd really recommend getting the education kits in boxes because they come in with quite a bit of pieces that are very useful in FLL, and so that allows you to get started and to get familiar with pieces that are going to be very useful. The boxes are also very handy to keep your pieces tidy. They can be stored away quite simply, and they're easy to carry. So, for example, we were using one as a field kit, and that's where we had all the pieces we knew we needed to have in spare for competition days. Now, of course, this is absolutely not sponsored. This is just what worked best for us. What's likely is that after a certain point, you'll need to order spare pieces anyways. I mean, after a few years of FLL, we had entire large Ziploc bags of certain pieces that we used all the time and basically never had enough of. But at least this should get you started.
Another essential is a match table. Now, of course, you can start off by just slapping down the mat on the floor, which is what we did at first, as you can see on the right. But this will only get you so far because you won't actually be able to practice the full motion of the matches. So we went through different iterations, starting with just a few planks, and then we built our very own match table that could be taken apart quickly. And you can find some of these instructions to build a table in the season resources on the First LEGO League website. You'll also need a computer to program the robot and to do research on the project. And then you'll need a ton of paper and pencils. We went through a lot between drawing out our ideas on the rope for robot design, planning out our strategy, making to-do lists, and anything of the sort. Make sure to keep all of that filed away and stored securely so you can not only show the judges your initial thoughts for a certain design, but actually log all of your ideas for a project at the start of the season. We'd also recommend printing out the robot game rules so you always have them on hand while practicing or at competitions, and be able to annotate them if need be. You can also print out the engineering notebooks if that's a tool your team would be likely to use.
All right, so now you have the team members, the coaches and mentors. You found a place to meet. The supplies we listed above are on their way or they have already arrived. What should you do? Well, at first, you could do team building activities. So, for example, you could come up with your team name and your team logo. For us, we knew we wanted something related to our first season, and that happened to be Animal Allies. So, we wanted to have an animal name in our team name. So, you can find something that's fun and memorable for your team too. You could also spend time learning more about the theme together, or you could learn about the different parts of FLL. Since you're starting out, you'll want to read some of the challenge documents and watch the release video together to discover what the core values are, to find out what the project prompt is this year, or to see what the missions are going to be, even if you don't already have the map with you. Talking about a project, it is never too early to start thinking about it. And make sure to write things down anytime you think of a problem you could work on and maybe potential solutions you have in mind once you narrow down the problems you are interested in. And even without the mat, you can start building and programming. We started by building a very basic robot and we learned to program it. We also experimented with the sensors, which brings us to something we had promised you in the season release video. Let's give you a rundown of the different motors and sensors you can use in FLL.
It's time for the crash course. Let's start with the motors. You have two kinds, large and medium. Large motors are the ones that you want to use to move your robot around by attaching them to the wheels. You'll want to use two of them for that purpose so your robot can turn, for instance. And those are the ones that you'll use for wheel counts. Essentially, you want to travel a certain distance, you'll need to determine how many rotations of the wheels you'll need to get that far. Of course, that depends on the wheel you use because you'll want to apply what you learned in geometry to calculate the perimeter of the wheel that you're using. And another side note about wheels is that you might want to use to first test them out. We found that these big ones worked best for us because, amongst other things, they didn't skid as much on the mat as the ones we used during our first season. So wheel counts were more accurate. Another thing to note is that we used only two of these wheels because at the back we had these little ball joints that enabled us a greater range of motion and also only two motors dedicated to those wheels. Medium motors are the ones that you'll use to activate the mechanisms or attachments you designed to interact with mission models. By the way, what we call attachments are things that you use to attach, so clip on or slide onto your robot for a specific launch during the match. For example, we had a base robot that pushed a chariot-like attachments for most launches during our second season, Hydrodynamics, and it had two medium motors at the front with various ways to connect it easily and quickly. And then later on, we used these two motors to create a gearbox to have more outputs, so up to 8, although we had only 6 that we actually used. And then one important thing to note about motors is that you can take just 4 of them to the match table, so choose wisely and don't plan on switching them out during the matches.
Now let's talk about sensors. There are multiple ones, but we'll only focus on the ones you can use in FLL. So first, there's a touch sensor, which nowadays is also called the force sensor. We recommend you start with this one when you learn about sensors because it's the easiest to manipulate and it's great to understand what a sensor actually does, which essentially is to detect certain information or a certain change in information in the environment around the robot. So, well, it's a robot in your case. For the touch sensor, it can be the event when your touch sensor is touched. So that means that the piece that's sticking out is pushed. This is also a very reliable and very fun sensor to work with, especially for newer teams who are still learning about the other sensors and how to use them. Then there's the gyro sensor, which is actually now built into the Spike robot. It detects changes in the angle of the robot. So, for example, when your robot turns, and it can also be used to go towards a certain heading. In that case, you'll want to learn about resetting the gyro and always doing that in the same direction. However, it's true that the gyro can be buggy, and even when the robot is standing still, it can think that it's turning, causing what we used to nickname a slow drift, or sometimes even a really fast one, in the values that your sensor was seeing in the heading of your robot, which can really offset your actual heading, and in the worst of cases, it can make your robot spin on itself in the middle of a match table. Now, what we found worked to avoid that problem on the free robot was to always reset the gyro on a stable surface anytime we turn the robot on or before batch. And another thing we did was that we never used download and run when we were programming it. In most cases, anyways, the gyro is going to be the bread and butter of navigation in FLL, especially in cases where you cannot follow a line.
Which leads us logically to the color sensor. So there are different modes that you can use. We use them to follow the lines on the mat or detect them to know where we were or to square on them. So that's to say to align properly and fix our heading in certain areas. For that, the mode we found the most convenient and reliable was the reflect light intensity mode, which is basically in the name. When light bounces off the surface you're looking at, so the mat in this case, you want to see how intense the light is. So lighter surfaces reflect the light better. The intensity is measured over white parts of the line will be stronger than the black parts. For line following, this will also be an opportunity to learn about what's called a PID line following algorithm, which was we mentioned in the previous episode. And you'll want to learn about properly calibrating your color sensors before the match. The ultrasonic sensor, also called distance sensor and spike because it allows you to determine the distance separating the sensor from an article in front of it, we never really used beyond playing around with it during our first season, mainly just because we didn't think it was very reliable. You can use as many sensors as you'd like during the match, but keep in mind that it takes a lot of time to actually physically switch out these sensors, or at least the cables. So keep in mind, be wary of the time that it takes compared to your total 2 minutes and 30 seconds on the match table.
Now, let's say the mat has finally arrived. That means that it's time to build the mission models as a team. And actually, what we did for the first few seasons was to both be looking at the same one when we were building them to double check. And then in later seasons, once we had gotten the hang of it, we'd still take a break and ask the other one for a double check anytime we had doubts about what we were seeing in the instructions. You want to be very careful when you build the mission models, because if you build them differently than you're intended to, then they might not function properly, or they won't function like they're supposed to. And in the worst case scenario, that could mean a very bad surprise for your team on the day of the competition. When you get the mat, you also want to make sure that you give it time to flatten out, since it's probably been rolled up in a box for quite a while. And you also want to make sure that you are placing it properly on your table, especially at the time of recording. You need to center it on the table. Another thing to note is that you'll need to use dual lock, which is provided in the box for to attach the mission models to the mat. And it is a little hard to adjust. So if you don't want to end up with raw fingers because it can scratch your hands a little bit, you want to be really careful when you're placing it. Definitely what you want to do is to look at the mat before you set up the mission models and look for the little boxes that are crossed out to see where you need to place a dual lock. Sometimes it's true that you do need to cut a piece of dual lock in half for this. And you can also look at the outlines of the models on the mat to see where they go. And of course, you want to make sure that you are applying a piece of dual lock to the mat, but also to the corresponding part of the mission models you need to put there. And then once all of that is done, you can go through the list of missions together while seeing how they work for the first time. So you can move them around, see how you're supposed to set them up. And once you have that in mind, you can start checking off which missions you want to tackle first and to start thinking about your strategy or to take notes about the different missions.
So thank you so much for watching. We're really excited for you all to start working on this year's FLL season. Be sure to tag us on Reddit or comment any other questions you may have and we'll get back to you. And we'll see you in the next one.